name is Susan Dykser, and I will be talking to Jeanne Price and Dr. Martin Griffin today about Rosie Verrall, who is the Marin Women's Hall of Fame honoree in the area of the environment for 2008. Jeanne, maybe we could start with you, since you know something about her early life.
Yes, Rosie and her family, as I understand it, came to San Francisco, immigrated from the Azores. They were Portuguese, and they came to San Francisco where they lived, at least Rosie lived, for 3 years. And then when she was 3 years old, her family moved to the Tiburon Peninsula, which was then the Corte Madera del Presidio Rancho, the Mexican land grant that had been given to John Thomas Reed. And they were tenants on this property, and at first Mr. Rodrigues de Fonta worked for the ferry. He worked on the ferry called Tiburon, and he was in charge of keeping the lamps clean and lit. But Rodrigues de Fonta was a little too hard for the owner of the captain of the ferry boat, so he just said, "I'll call you Rogers." So that's that name. She's also known by that name. And then after a while, he worked at the dairies. There were a number of dairies on the rancho, and he became a dairyman and worked there.
What years did this cover?
She actually moved to Marin in 1886 when she was 3 years old with her family, and then she lived on that property. That property was later deeded to her by John Paul Reed, who was the grandson of the original owner, and before he died in 1919, he deeded some of the land over to some of the people who were his tenants. And Rosie and her family, well, he deeded it to Rosie, although it was and her family, and then she lived there for 77 years.
Wow.
Until she died.
So there is a bit of a story behind him deeding the land to her.
Oh, yes.
Rather than to her family. Would you like to get into that a little bit?
Well, it's what one writer called, they referred to each other as my dear friend.
Oh.
And so this was to kind of it was an intimate relationship, but that they were very formal and considered each other my good friend.
I see. So they were lovers, we would say today.
Yes.
And why did they never marry?
Well, the reason that they never married, one reason that I heard, was that John Paul's half-sister, Clotilda, did not approve of Rosie, and so she kind of squashed it. But John Paul never married, and he died at 54 as a bachelor.
Oh, my goodness. Did the social conventions of the time play into this disapproval, would you say? Was it not only family? Was it social conventions as well?
Well, I sort of got the impression that Clotilda felt that, Rosie was beneath him. I mean, he was the owner. He was the lord of the manor, and she was the dairyman's daughter, so to speak.
And what year was it that they started this relationship? Do you know?
That I don't know.
Okay,
but he was 18. He was 18 years older than she was.
Oh, he
yes,
was.
Yes.
I see. So she had to be. She was close to 20, or
yes, in their late teens and the early 20s.
Late teens, early 20s.
Yeah, she was 25, I think, in 1919 when he passed on.
Oh wow! And he was 54.
54, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. So, what a shame, what a shame. But she went on and lived on the land, and I understand she had goats, and she was famous for these goats.
Yes, but she had a number of different animals. I mean, she had chickens and all of this. She lived on this and lived off the land, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
And but she did have goats in her later years. And when she was 50 years old, she married Mr. Verrall, who was a printer.
Oh, she did get married.
Yes,
oh,
that's where the Verrall part comes in.
Yeah, I see.
And so, but she did have goats, and she was ahead of her time in terms of being a conservationist, because she pegged the goats, and then they just ate in a big circle and kept the grass mowed.
Perfect.
That way.
Yeah.
Yes. And then she used to have the baby goats, the kids. She and her husband, Mr. Verrall, would take into a TV show in San Francisco, and it was called Trudy's, wasn't that the name of it?
I think so.
Yeah, Trudy's, and she would have these pet goats once a week, I think it was. She took them in on the bus.
No. On the municipal buses.
Yes, yeah, and let her come on with the goats, So
Well, they were little. They were
just,
babies.
they could be held in her arms.
Yeah.
So.
And this was for a show that
It's
she
for a television
presented?
show. It was a children's television show.
Wow. That's wonderful. So she was not only a conservationist, but she was advertised taking care of animals in the land.
Yes. Well, I mean, she used the goats for, and now it's quite the thing to hire a goat herd with his goats to come in and clear out your overgrown areas.
Absolutely. No gasoline,
Right.
just methane.
I think I would also like to say about Rosie, and that she, as an environmentalist, she, as Beverly Bastian likes to say, she gave all that she had. She gave 100%. What she had was her land, and she gave it all. So she made a tremendous contribution to this, and that was the impetus really for the saving of Richardson Bay, which could at one time have been filled and turned into a houses with a marina.
Oh, I
So-
understand some lots were
Some lots,
designated
lots of
in
lots.
the water. Lots of lots.
But it would have been filled land, taking down the Tiburon Hills and filling the bay.
Yes.
So she did that, and also I wanted to be sure that that because she was Portuguese, she did represent a lot of Portuguese immigrants that came and lived in Marin County and have contributed to the welfare of the county all these years.
Oh, that's wonderful. And thank you for mentioning Beverly Bastian. I understand that she couldn't make it to be here with us today, but you're speaking for her in that she's told you stories and you are
Right,
relaying
and
them.
those last 2 points are things she very much wanted to get across, then, because they were part of her application for Rosie to be honored by the Women's Hall of Fame.
I see. Wonderful. And so she did donate the land that is now the Audubon Society
Sanctuary, yes, it's called the
sanctuary on
Richardson Bay.
Bay.
Yeah, Richardson Bay Audubon Center and Sanctuary.
And there was a home that went with it, a large house.
Well, no, the house was brought over after she had given over her land. And
Oh, I see.
yeah, that was what is referred to now as the Lyford House, which was on Strawberry Point. And it was going to be raised, and it was in really poor condition. And that was Dr. Steinhardt, another conservationist
Another
down that way,
conservationist.
that saw to the saving of the house, and where Rosie lived provided the land that it could be put onto and saved. But Rosie, now Marty can tell more about Rosie and how she lived, and she lived in a shack, didn't she, Marty?
Well, she did. When I first ran into Rosie was when I was asked to be on the board of the Marin Audubon Society, which was new and was created by Mrs. Livermore because she couldn't get any help from the National Audubon Society unless they had a local Audubon Society. And she was trying to stop the filling of the bay for a 2,000-home marina, which was on the books, and which the land was owned by a couple of doctors who were good friends of mine, and former good friends.
Oh, no.
And it was also owned by Utah Construction, which was a very powerful company, and they just filled 400 acres off of Alameda, so they knew how to do it.
Oh, yeah.
They were going to tear down the hill to do it. But Mrs. Livermore recognized that Rosie's pasture was the key to saving the whole bay, that side of the bay, because of its prominence and beauty. And so she made a deal with Rosie that she would provide, that the Marin Conservation League would provide housing for Rosie and a good place for her to sleep, and a new bathroom, and lifetime care by a physician Me.
You.
And the only problem was that she hadn't asked me before.
So you obviously in the end agreed.
Well, I was honored because Mrs. Livermore was a very prominent person in this county.
Yes.
It was the grand dame of conservation in the county, and was well known, and so I was very happy to be associated with her. But she was trying to raise money to buy out the owners of the bay. You have to understand that all of California's tidelands and had been subdivided, and which was illegal, and that the land actually belonged to the public under what's called the doctrine of public trust.
I see. And she knew that.
She knew that.
And,
But-
and why would she have to buy it then if it already belonged to the public?
Well, it would have taken a long legal battle. It would have cost a lot more than buying the land outright. So she needed money, and $250,000 about to buy these developers' interest in Richardson Bay.
What year was that?
Well, that was in 1955 or 57.
So that was a lot of money back then.
It was.
Yeah.
Anyway, she came to me and she said, Dr. Griffin, you've got to get Rosie in better shape. You're her doctor, and I want her presentable so she can appear with my friends, who are prominent people and members of the Piedmont Garden Club and the Marin Garden Club and the Peninsula Garden Club. So she said, you've got to make her presentable. So I got my nurse from the clinic to come down and got Bill Goodall, who was the representative of the National Audubon Society, and we had to run her all over the pasture
To catch her?
to catch her. And I knew there was something seriously wrong with her because her stockings seemed like they were glued to her legs, and she seemed to be in pain. And that was why she ran. She didn't want anybody to touch her. And we finally corralled her, and my nurse cut off the stockings, and she had ulcers on her legs, which must have been extremely painful. Well, after we treated him, she became my best friend.
I bet you did. Take away my pain, I'm yours forever. That's great.
So I would take her up to the clinic twice a week in Ross, and my nurse would dress her wounds, and then she outfitted her in some very regal clothes that Mrs. Livermore provided from her own closet. They had to be shortened considerably because Mrs. Verrall was a very short woman.
I see.
But she started looking really good, and she walked down the boardwalk there. Somebody got a picture of her, just dolled up to the teeth
With her goat. She had the goat.
Yes, she had the goat
I'd
with her.
love to see that picture. I hope they include it in this segment. So how old was Rosie when she took this walk on the boardwalk with her goat, looking regal?
I think it was just before her 80th birthday.
Oh,
And,
so she was a long-lived woman.
she was.
Yeah.
And she actually became very competitive with Mrs. Livermore and decided that she was going to outlive her, but she didn't. And,
But she didn't.
uh,
Dr. Griffin, what age was Rosie when you came into her life?
She was about 70.
She was about 70 and running around the pastures,
Oh,
eh?
yeah, she took good care of her goats, and she would walk into Mill Valley every day
Wow.
for a little bag of chocolates, which people saw her carrying back to her place.
Chocoholic, I like her. Now, how many miles was that, would you say, that she would
Probably
walk?
4 or 5 miles.
4 or 5 miles every day. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, she was strong and wiry. She was small,
Uh-huh.
and but I did get her with the help of my nurse into good condition, and she would stand in receiving lines with Mrs. Livermore and Mrs. Terwilliger and
Oh,
then
wow.
Rosie.
Wow.
And sort of like that. And,
All in good company, all
Yeah.
of them. Yeah. And she never had children of her own.
I don't believe so.
Her goats were kind of like her children. Huh?
The only relative that we know of that showed up at this presentation was a relative of Mr. Verrall, her husband.
I see.
And he came and he gave a little history that we didn't know about. And
Did he predecease her husband?
Yes,
He died before she did.
yes.
Yeah.
And you know, the walk into Mill Valley, I didn't know about the chocolates, but I used to hear that she went to a bakery on Miller Avenue, and she would go in there and have a little snack and then walk home. And I have seen her, when I first moved to Belvedere, walking along the Tiburon Boulevard with grocery bags.
Oh, my
And she would
goodness.
go and do that. But somebody told me, and since she's a legend, you know, stories grow up around legends, and whether it's true or not, they said she also used to visit her bookie in Mill Valley because she liked to bet on the horses. I have no idea whether that's true or not, but
Well, it's a
what
wonderful
happened.
story, whether it's true
Right.
or not. No, I know that you have a story about something about the construction of the Cove shopping center. Or
No, it wasn't a shopping
apartments.
center. It's the Cove where they are apartment complex,
Oh, apartment
which is
complex.
across from where the Cove Shopping Center is.
I
And
see.
when they were dredging in there and so forth, one of the local men worked on the bulldozer or the dredger, and he would say, and Rosie was very, very interested. She was a real sidewalk superintendent about that thing going on right next door to her property. And so he would say, "Hey, Rosie, why don't you sell us your property, and then we'll knock down this little hill that's on her property and fill the bay." And then she got her stick that she herded the goats with and started after him.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and chased him off the property.
That was
And he-
blasphemy, right?
Yeah, and he said, "She wouldn't even let me go back for my lunchbox." So,
She just sounds wonderful, just like a wonderful person.
one of the things that she did was to sell 3 or 4 acres of her land to a man who lived in Belvedere. And I got worried that that acreage, which went way out into the bay and had 1 acre of uplands right up to the highway, would have become another Cove Apartments.
Uh-huh.
And so 10 years later, after she died, I was able to persuade the board of Audubon Canyon Ranch, which
Good for you.
Jean's husband was president of at one time,
that's right.
and to send me back to Chicago to talk to this guy and see if we couldn't persuade him to sell it to us. And so they authorized me to offer him up to, I think it was $60,000 for his 3 or 4 acres. So I went back there, and he treated me very well. And he heard all the stories about Rosie and Mrs. Livermore, and he said it would be a shame to have another Cove Apartments there. But he said, you know what, 60,000 is enough. It would take $1 million.
$1 million? What year was this?
That would be about 1967.
Oh.
And anyway, we parted friends, and I came back to California. When I got back, there was a message on the line saying Dr. Griffin called Mr. Marshall in Chicago. So I called him, and he said, you know, I've been thinking about this deal, and I'm going to give this land to the National Audubon Society. But, you know, he said, I'm so upset that they never called me. Nobody ever approached me about it until you. And so I was known as sort of aggressive on land acquisition.
Oh,
You were a hero.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful story. I know that you are a member of the Landmark Society, and you know a lot about the history of this area. And could you tell us the importance of getting that piece of land at that time? Was development rampant in that area?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that. When I was going through my file that I have on Rosie, I found a picture in there. I have no idea who gave it to me, but it's a picture of Rosie holding a goat and another woman, much younger than Rosie, who's very dressed up, standing in high heels in her meadow, holding another little kid in her arms. And on the back it says Easter 1957. And there was, behind them were the Tiburon Hills, and there wasn't a tree, there wasn't a house, there wasn't a cow up there on the thing. So there, at that time, there was not much, nothing much had been done so far. But yes, it was happening. And the important thing was what Marty and I have already referred to, is that with the gift of Rosie's property, giving all that she had, this became the cornerstone of the saving of Richardson Bay, which was extremely important, because the whole Tiburon Peninsula would look entirely different now than it does. And we wouldn't have that sanctuary, which is a bird sanctuary for overwintering migrating birds there. It would have all been filled. So that was very key. The giving of her property was very key to that. So
Again,
it really,
because,
really preserved at least the west side of the Tiburon Peninsula.
And that's because the lots originally, the proposed lots, went into the water.
They were underwater lots,
They
right,
were
Marty?
underwater lots.
Yes.
Underwater lots, and there were underwater lots laid out all along the Sausalito side of Richardson Bay,
My, oh my.
all along the Tiburon Peninsula side.
Not a good idea to build on fill, as we saw in the marina during the recent, the earthquake in the 80s. So that would have been not a good idea, not only from a conservationist point of view, but from a humanistic point of view as well.
This was the first big effort to save San Francisco Bay that really worked. There have been a lot of work to, committee meetings and effort to get legislation through, but I think that Richardson Bay was the start of the battle to really go all out to save San Francisco Bay from development.
Wonderful. And was it because, I just kind of want to get this clear in my mind, was it because that land and the underwater lots were donated, so it forestalled building and developing on the other underwater lots, that it needed that piece for it to be stable or practical to develop?
Well, I went to a meeting of the State Lands Commission, which is in charge of all the land that's considered public trust lands along rivers and bays and ocean. And our planning director stood up and told the State Lands Commission to get out of the real estate business, to stop giving away these tide lands for $1 an acre or whatever. And so this was sort of the start of that. It became harder and harder to fill land.
Your work with Rosie sounds like it was work, certainly, but kind of fun as well.
It was. It didn't endure me with my clinic doctors, my fellow doctors at the Ross Valley Clinic, because we'd have her come during the lunch hour, then we'd have to close the clinic for a couple of hours to air it out.
Was that because she brought the goats or because she smelled like a goat?
Well, she slept with the goats occasionally to get warm.
Oh, wow. So she really lived a very basic life.
Yeah.
Very on with the earth, with the animals.
Mrs. Livermore changed her life completely. And her sons built a beautiful bench out of concrete overlooking the bay right near the Lyford house that was moved over. And Rosie was so envious that they had to build one for her, too.
Oh, good, good. She sounds like a woman with a lot of spirit.
Yes.
A lot of spirit and a lot of
Yeah.
heart.
She'd had a very hard life. She lived in a very, as you say, basic fashion.
Yes.
And so she was, she looked almost like an anachronism walking along the road, because she was kind of bent over, and she was very wrinkled, and she wore kind of tacky clothes and all that sort of thing. You would have no idea that she was this beautiful, beautiful young woman.
Uh-huh. Yeah. But she did what she wanted to do with her life. She loved her animals, she loved the land, and she was an early steward of the land.
Exactly.
Yeah, and left it for all of us. It's a wonderful story, and it's wonderful that there are people like you that study and record this history, write books about it, and I'm sure you're both proud to say that you were involved with this Audubon Society gift.
I think Rosie would be very happy, don't you, with the way her land has been used by the Audubon Society, and it has a lot of educational programs that are very popular, especially for young people and children, and people are really enjoying what she left for them.